article here by Ali Abumina at the Electronic Intifada, titled "It's time to change the discourse about Hamas." It's time to change liberal discourse about Hamas. I'm sorry, and I completely agree. Members of the Qassam Brigade, the military wing of Hamas, displayed their rockets during a parade in the northern Gaza Strip, May 30th. Got his little automatic weapon there. Looks like nice. Rep. Ilhan Omar may have thought she was doing Palestinians a favor when she challenged Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in a congressional hearing on Monday, but her comments about Hamas only reinforce Israeli propaganda delegitimizing Palestinian resistance. It's completely on point. Sadly, Omar's both-sidism is a common feature of discourse even among ostensibly pro-Palestinian liberals. Omar posted this clip of her exchange with Blinken. In her tweet, she wrote that, quote, "We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity." And then she listed U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. I mean, for fuck's sake, the only two here that are committing crimes against humanity are the United States and Israel. Like, yes, it's time to change the fucking liberal discourse about Hamas. Completely agree. She claimed, "We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban." Omar rightly challenges Blinken over U.S. opposition to the ICC investigation of these alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. I would emphasize that in Israel and Palestine, this includes crimes committed both by the Israeli security forces and Hamas, she says. In Afghanistan, it includes crimes committed by the Afghan national government and the Taliban. So I'm not sure if Ali is going to point out in this article, but this potential ICC investigation, Hamas was fucking welcoming it. They were fine with the ICC coming in and investigating so-called crimes against humanity because they know they didn't fucking commit any. And you know who doesn't want them to come in? The U.S. and Israel. Why do you think that is? Because they know the ICC would find these crimes against humanity that Israel committed with direct support of the United fucking States. I would emphasize that in Israel... I just read that in her spoken comments. Omar notably admits crimes committed by the U.S. Blinken's response, as many have correctly noted, is as hypocritical and dishonest as expected. He falsely claims that Palestinians can seek justice in Israel. Yes, I'm sure they can seek justice as they're being forcibly fucking ethnically cleansed from their homes by this fucking settler colonial state. Maureen Murphy. Israeli forces... I'm sure they can seek fucking justice as well as in apartheid Israel. Like, Jesus, like, and this is again Democratic administration. Anthony Blinken. Israeli forces have killed more than 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza since the ICC probe began in 2015. I can count on one hand, maybe two, the number of Israeli soldiers who have been tried in connection to the death of a Palestinian. Think about that. Very similar to the amount of cops who have been tried in connection with the murder of black and brown people in the United States, who they just extrajudicially assassinate almost on a daily basis here in white supremacist USA. There's Blinken, he's a piece of shit. Blinken's response was that they can seek justice in Israel, the state that occupies and carries out daily violence against them. Who wants to tell them apartheid states are not democracies? Same with the fucking U.S., not a democracy. No equivalence. But it's deeply troubling that Omar, who has been raising election campaign money off her rhetorical support for Palestinians, describes Palestinian resistance and self-defense as crimes against humanity and equates it with Israel's colonial violence. And again, she is one of these more progressive members of Congress, and this is her making this false equivalence. It's disgusting. This is a cheap and easy way to demonstrate a false even-handedness, just as criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu has become the politically acceptable way. I gotta go shut that window. 1 sec. Goddamn noise pollution, leaf blowers and shit. Just as criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu has become the politically acceptable way for U.S. politicians to appear to be tough in Israel without actually challenging its fundamental racism. The politically harder case to make, but the correct one, is that there is no more... This is the important distinction. There is no moral equivalence between a colonized people, again, exercising its internationally recognized right to resist with the means it has, and a nuclear-armed state using advanced weaponry to murder and terrorize those people into submission. Yes, 100%. Israel's list of atrocities is too long and well known to repeat here. In addition to expelling 800,000 Palestinians during its founding, Israel's killed some 100,000 Palestinians and Arabs since 1948, beginning decades before Hamas was established in 1988. Israel's attack in Gaza last month involved deliberate targeting of civilian homes, wiping out whole families, and large-scale destruction of business, media office, and infrastructure, including fucking hospitals and roads. The horror was so stark that even the New York Times, Israel's an unofficial American image consultancy, could no longer just brush it under the carpet. Wow. Look at that. Just one person, that is all the people he lost during that. But Ilhan Omar, I'm drawing this false fucking equivalency between Hamas exercising its resistance by any means necessary as against this colonizing, repressive apartheid regime that is the state of Israel. Here, they were just children. Israel slaughtered them. Palestinian children murdered by Israel on the front page of the New York Times. Look at that. And again, the narrative is starting to shift. Like, you really see it. And I think that's one of the reasons that Netanyahu is out as PM, because of this shift. If it is ridiculous to compare Hamas violence both in context and quantity to that of Israel, it is even more absurd to place the Palestinian group in the company of the U.S. Since World War II, the U.S. has left an unparalleled toll of death and destruction around the world, and it continues to do so. He's completely correct. Millions have been killed by U.S. wars, coups, and inventions from Southeast Asia to Guatemala to Iraq and many countries in between. I mean, for God's sakes, we only need to look no further than that 60 Minutes interview Madeleine Albright gave, where she was asked, about the sanctions that we had in Iraq placed on Iraq in the 90s, because we didn't like Saddam Hussein, that killed 500,000 Iraqi fucking children. She thought that price was worth paying. But what are the atrocities Hamas is accused of by Ilhan Omar? Indiscriminate rockets. We're often told that Hamas is guilty of targeting civilians because it indiscriminately fired thousands of rockets towards Israel's cities and strategic assets. The main purpose of these rockets is to deter Israel and to impose a cost on it for its ethnic cleansing attacks on Palestinians, whether in Gaza or Jerusalem. Again, they have the right, under international law, to defend themselves by any means necessary. And if these so-called rocket attacks are indiscriminate, that would be included in that. They are, for fuck's sake, it's in response to the people being ethnically cleansed, for God. Their development was a response to Israel's attempt to physically isolate Gaza from the rest of Palestine in order to fragment and weaken Palestinians and facilitate the colonial theft of their land. We have decided to defend our people with whatever weapons we have. Hamas leader of Gaza. Territory is currently governed by the Palestinian militant group. As Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza, explained in a recent interview with Vice News, Palestinians do not use unguided rockets by choice. Israel, which possesses a complete arsenal of weaponry, state-of-the-art equipment, aircraft, largely thanks to the U.S., $4 billion in aid a year, intentionally bombs their children and women on purpose. That's frankly a pretty important distinction, right? Israel has all this precision-guided missiles and weaponry, and yet they indiscriminately bomb on purpose people's homes, hospitals, media buildings, roads, etc. You can't compare that to those who resist and defend themselves with weapons that look primitive by comparison. If we had the capabilities to launch precision missiles that targeted military targets, we wouldn't have used the rockets that we did. It's an important distinction. Again, by any means necessary. That's what he's saying here. We are forced to defend our people with what we have, and this is what we have. Indeed, it is rare to hear any of those complaining that Palestinian rockets are indiscriminate, urging, say, the United States or the EU to arm Palestinians with precision weapons as they arm Israel. It's a fair point. Haven't heard that discourse, have you? It is true, nonetheless, that rockets are not harmless to civilian life. During the 11 days of intensified violence last month, 11 people were killed in Israel due to rocket fire, and a soldier was killed near the Gaza-Israel boundary by an anti-tank weapon. According to Sinwar, Hamas did not use its full capabilities in the recent escalation. This assertion, if true, would indicate that the group's goal is not to cause maximum death and destruction, but to use the minimum force necessary to achieve the resistance goals of deterrence and self-defense. So they are actually, showing restraint, unlike this colonial apartheid regime that is Israel, who just uses maximum force whenever they fucking want because it's just a sick, sadistic regime. Contrast that with the 250 Palestinians, including at least 67 children killed in Gaza, as Israel bombarded the territory night and day with precision weapons for the purpose of crushing resistance to an apartheid regime. And all they did is strengthen it, and especially with international solidarity. It seems like being at an all-time high for the Palestinian cause. Every life is precious, yes, but equating Israel colonial violence with Palestinian resistance, as Omar does, obscures these facts. Violence starts with the oppressor. For the sake of completeness, we must consider whether Hamas atrocities Omar mentioned possibly refers to the suicide bombings previously carried out by Palestinians from the mid-90s as a desperate asymmetrical response to the violence of Israeli occupation. Palestinian orgs abandoned the widely condemned tactic after 2008, so 13 plus years ago. Similar violence has, however, been a part and parcel of anti-colonial struggle, with indigenous groups seeking to impose their colonizers with the taste of the terror the colonizers first imposed on them. Nelson Mandela, now treated as a saint by Western political leaders who support Israel's massacre of Palestinians and condemn Palestinian resistance, explained that in his autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom. I remember, this is a pretty famous quote. "It is always the oppressor, not the oppressed, who dictates the form of the struggle," Mandela writes. "If the oppressor uses violence, the oppressed have no alternative but to respond violently. In our case, it was a legitimate form of self-defense." And obviously, the same thing can be applied to Hamas. It's a legitimate form of self-defense. "It is up to you, not us, to renounce violence," Mandela recalls telling the apartheid regime. During the early days of the armed struggle, Mandela affirms that his ANC preferred tactics that would not kill people. But he makes clear if sabotage did not produce the results we wanted, we were prepared to move on to the next stage, guerrilla warfare and terrorism. In Palestine, the bombing of marketplaces, hotels, and other civilian areas began not as a part of anti-colonial struggle, but as a colonial tactic introduced by Zionist settlers in the 30s to terrorize indigenous Palestinians and prevent them from exercising their right to self-determination. Even if Palestinians were only emulating the Zionists, it seems Unlikely a suicide bombing of the 90s and the early 2000s are the atrocities Omar is referring to. First, as noted, the tactic has long been abandoned, a decade plus. Second, suicide bombings were not only carried out by Hamas, but by other Palestinian groups as well, including the Fatah faction of Mohammed Abbas, the U.S.-backed leader of the Palestinian Authority, who remains a close ally of Israel and with whom Blinken is eager to reestablish warm ties. Third, it can hardly be said that victims of such bombing had no access to justice, or what might properly be called revenge. Israel carried out numerous extrajudicial executions in response to the attacks, including of Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, the Hamas founder, who was blind and had used a wheelchair since childhood. 2003, the year before it assassinated Yassin, Israel killed more bystanders in such revenge attacks than terrorists or suspected terrorists, according to the U.S. government. That, however, is not considered terrorism by the U.S. Israel has also jailed Fatah leader Marwan Barghouti since 2002. It accuses him of being one of the leaders of the Palestinian terror campaign of suicide bombings and shooting attacks on Israel citizens during the Second Intifada of the early 2000s. In a trial in which Barghouti refused to participate or defend himself, Israel convicted him of a role in attacks that killed 5 people and sentenced him to 5 life terms. Notably, even the Israeli judge, whom Barghouti likened to quote, pilots who fly planes and drop bombs on Palestinians, acquitted him of involvement in dozens of other violent acts for lack of evidence. Meanwhile, the U.S. has passed countless anti-terrorism laws that collectively punish Palestinians and Palestinian Americans in U.S. courts for acts which Hamas is accused. By contrast, Palestinians have no recourse in the U.S. courts as Israel U.S.-sponsored crimes against them. As Ilhan Omar rightly highlights, the U.S. now seeks to deny Palestinians access to justice at the ICC as well. But Blinken says that, well, they can just seek justice in Israel. They can just do that. At the same time, every form of resistance Palestinians engage in, from armed struggle to nonviolent boycotts like the BDS movement, is routinely condemned by the so-called international community. Well-behaved victims. One of the easiest political ploys in the West is to demonize Hamas, among other Palestinian groups, as wild-eyed religious fanatics bent on death and destruction for its own sake or due to irrational hatred of Jews. That's always been Israel's propaganda message, and sadly, it is one that Omar's comments play into whether she intends to or not. Since its establishment, especially in the last 2 decades, Hamas has moved to the mainstream of Palestinian national politics. It asserted its independence from the Muslim Brotherhood, the transnational org founded in Egypt a century ago, and accepted the 1967 border as the basis for a Palestinian state alongside Israel. It also explicitly repudiated language, some of its earlier documents that borrowed from classical European anti-Semitic tropes. These changes were confirmed in a document outlining its guiding principles released in 2017. Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. There you go. The document states Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they're Jewish, but wage a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. There you go. I mean, it's from their own fucking document. It's an anti-colonial project. They want the colonizers out of their fucking land, and they're willing to use whatever means they have to further that goal, and we should fucking support that. And nor is it the preferred means, as Hamas leader Sinwar explained in his Vice interview. We know we don't want war or fighting because it costs lives and our people deserve peace, yes. It is a likely reference to the 2018 Great March Return, to which Israel responded by ordering snipers to shoot children, Sinwar added. For long periods of time, we tried peaceful resistance and popular resistance. But instead of acting to stop Israel's crimes and massacre, the world stood by and watched as the occupation war machine killed our young children. He's right. Does the world expect us to be well-behaved victims while we're being killed, for us to be slaughtered without making a noise? I mean, put it in a different context. Imagine in the United States, if another country came in, occupied, whatever, I mean, I would argue, like, when the colonizers first came to the United States and engaged in all these atrocities and genocide against the native people, against the indigenous people to this land, those people would obviously have the right, by any means necessary, to fight back, to resist. Same thing with Palestinians, same thing with Hamas. A fact-based assessment of Hamas policies belies the racist propaganda lies that is merely a bloodthirsty org so intent on violence that it'll even use Palestinian children as human shields. Which is funny, given that, I mean, how many fucking kids, Palestinian children, has the Israeli apartheid state murdered? I mean, just last month alone, 67. 67. U.S. and Israel rejectionism. For many years, Hamas' political military strategy has been to emulate the path to policies followed by other national liberation anti-colonial movements, particularly Sinn Féin and the IRA. Those groups, long demonized as terrorists by the British, were nonetheless part of the negotiations that brought about the 1998 Belfast Agreement and ending decades of violence in Northern Ireland, in Ireland's north. The agreement also set out the political terms by which the Irish nationalists could achieve their goal of abolishing Northern Ireland, the partitioned statelet created by the British to protect the power and privileges of the predominantly Protestant settler colonial community. If Hamas and other Palestinian factions continue their military resistance, it is because Israel and its American and European sponsor rejected all of the generous and far-reaching Palestinian offers for accommodation with the Israelis. Even Hamas eventually acquiesced to the so-called two-state solution, in which Palestinians accepted a state of just 22% of their territory. So who's being the fucking unreasonable one here? It's not Hamas. It's not the Palestinians. If you can't see that, man, you get your head checked, I think. Israel's response has been total rejectionism, insisting that Israel should retain permanent possession control and Jewish supremacy in all land between the Jordan River and the Med Sea. Indeed, so extreme is this rejectionism that while the U.S. negotiates directly with the Taliban, with which it's fighting a war, it refuses any contact with Hamas, which has never been at war with the U.S. The U.S. brokered normalization deals various Arab regimes signed with Israel during the last year gave Israel further green light to escalate ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem. This forced Palestinian resistance factions in Gaza to respond militarily in defense of the Palestinians in Jerusalem, abandoned to their fate by the rest of the world. To place violence by the Palestinian resistance groups in the same categories as that of the colonial occupier or of the U.S. is to engage in reprehensible moral equivalence. It's no different to those who cry all lives matter when confronted with the reality of systemic racism and police violence against black people in the U.S. Yes, the lives of all human beings matter, but the responsibility for violence that takes those lives is not equally shared. Correct. Without a clear diagnosis of where the responsibility lies, and in Palestine, the root cause of all political violence is Zionist colonization, there can be no hope for a just peace priest that brings it to an end. Yes. Well said, Ali. Completely agree. Brings up really a lot of good points here, and I think Hamas saying if they had this precision-guided weaponry, they'd be using that. They're using what they have at their disposal. And, if that's the issue, this indiscriminate targeting, because that's the only weapons they have, okay, United States arm them with the same weapons you're giving the apartheid Zionist state of Israel, okay? Or these other EU places that are arming the apartheid state. So, good point. It's time to change liberal discourse about Hamas. Completely agree. I'll link it down below. Like the video if you like the damn video. Subscribe for more content. All power to the people. Peace. Much love.